The inertial forces. The great angular momentum of the universe not only keeps a steady sidereal rotation each day, you will recall from our previous analysis, it produces inertial forces as it rotates. These are the three inertial forces mentioned earlier, the centrifugal, the Coriolis and the Euler. In the geocentric system, it is these inertial forces which keep all the heavenly bodies in their respective positions and allow them to rotate around a fixed Earth, the center of mass for the universe. You will also recall that these same forces appear in the heliocentric system, but they are understood as fictitious forces, not real forces. We can demonstrate this by observing what the National Weather Service does when it wants to calculate the force of the wind relative to the rotating Earth. They first calculate the force of the wind relative to a stationary Earth, and then they calculate the force of the wind relative to a rotating Earth. To make the transition from a stationary Earth to a rotating Earth, they must add the three inertial forces to the equation, the centrifugal, or what they also call the centripetal, as well as the Coriolis, and the Euler. The equation that is used by the National Weather Service is the following. The wind speed vector in stationary space or a stationary Earth is d squared r over dt squared. This equals the wind speed vector on a rotating Earth, which is d squared r over dt squared, plus the Coriolis force, 2 omega cross v, plus the centrifugal centripetal force, omega cross r, plus the Euler force, d omega over dt cross r. This is the worldwide standard physics equation that transfers movement in a stationary frame to movement in a rotating or accelerating frame. Now, as noted, the heliocentric system has the Earth rotating in a fixed universe, which is understood as the Earth accelerating. In the heliocentric system, since the rotating Earth is accelerating and the universe is stationary, physicists must add in the three inertial forces to switch from the fixed universe to the accelerating Earth. As we can see, it is not as if three inertial forces only appear from outer space and apply themselves to the situation. Rather, because the rotating sphere of the Earth is constantly changing direction against Newton's concept of a fixed and absolute space, the engineer must compensate by adding in mathematical balancing forces to equalize the accelerated frame with the stationary frame. Only then will he be able to make the right predictions about wind speed or how his space probe will travel. In this heliocentric or moving Earth model, we can understand how these forces work together by observing what happens to a spinning skater. As she spins at one rate, she has a certain angular momentum, and she also has corresponding centrifugal, Coriolis, and Euler effects on her that are produced from her angular momentum. If she suddenly pulls in her arms, it causes her body to turn faster because the physics demands that the angular momentum be conserved. But by turning faster, she also increases the centrifugal, Coriolis, and Euler effects. Correspondingly, if she spreads her arms out, the conservation of angular momentum will cause a decrease in her turning speed, and also decrease the centrifugal, Coriolis and Euler effects acting on her. Notice that, in Newtonian mechanics, the increase or decrease of the centrifugal, Coriolis, and Euler are only considered effects of the angular momentum, not real forces. In this system, there is only one force, the angular momentum, and all other things are merely the results of the angular momentum. The centrifugal effect is such that if we placed a glass of water on the skater's shoulder and then she started to spin, the glass of water would fly off her shoulder and hit the ice. The Coriolis effect is such that if we placed a ping-pong ball on the surface of the glass of water, and then she started to spin, the ping-pong ball would not be able to go to the opposite side of the glass in a straight line but would move in a circular motion and hit another part of the glass. The Euler effect is such that when the skater starts to spin, the ping-pong ball would feel a sudden jerk backward. Now, since general relativity and its dynamic equations allows us to reverse roles so that the universe is rotating and thus accelerating, while the Earth is fixed, the same three inertial forces will appear, but they will appear because they are part of nature's forces, not because they are mere effects from some other force. In other words, the angular momentum of the rotating universe will produce centrifugal, Coriolis, and Euler forces by nature, forces that actually move objects in one direction or another. We learn this, for example, from Einstein's paper on general relativity. He says, quote, "We need not necessarily trace the existence of the centrifugal forces back to an absolute movement of k', that is, a rotation or revolution of the Earth. We can instead just as well trace them back to the rotational movement of the distant ponderable masses, that is, the universe of stars, in relation to k', the Earth, whereby we treat k', the Earth, as being at rest." Unquote. In other words, Einstein is saying that the centrifugal force that occurs when the Earth rotates so that a slight bulge can be measured at the Earth's equator, the reciprocal is also required by relativity's physical dynamics, so that the cause of the bulge is that the universe is rotating around a fixed Earth. Since the Earth does not know the universe is rotating around it, the cause for the bulge cannot be a difference in direction or an archetype of relative motion but must be from a precise force that is generated by the rotating universe, and is transferred directly to the Earth's equator. In the geocentric system, it is this actual force that, if the skater were to start spinning on a fixed Earth, would cause the glass of water to fall off her shoulder and hit the ice. It is what we understand as the centrifugal force. By the same token, Einstein's relativity also says the same about the Coriolis force. Einstein says the following. Quote, "First, if one accelerates a heavy shell of matter S, then a mass enclosed by that shell experiences an accelerative force. Second, if one rotates the shell relative to the fixed stars about an axis going through its center, a Coriolis force arises in the interior of the shell, that is, the plane of a Foucault pendulum is dragged around." Unquote. Taken from Einstein's 1913 letter to Ernst Mach. In other words, Einstein is saying that if we allow the universe to rotate around a fixed Earth, then any masses that are contained in the universe, such as galaxies, stars, suns, and moons, are going to feel the curving of the Coriolis force. Additionally, a little of that force is also going to be felt at the surface of the Earth since the surface is 4,000 miles from the Earth's center of mass. Likewise, it is this circular moving Coriolis force that will connect with the Foucault pendulum, and cause the pendulum to turn against a fixed Earth. It is the same force that, when the skater begins spinning on a fixed Earth, would cause the ping-pong ball on the surface of the glass of water to move in a curved direction and not a straight line. In the heliocentric system, the explanation for the Foucault pendulum is, of course, different. The fixed universe and its stars are understood to be aligned with the Foucault pendulum. As the Earth daily rotates underneath and independent of the pendulum, the observer, who is held to and aligned with the Earth as the Earth rotates, will see the situation as if the pendulum is moving in a circle around the observer. In the heliocentric system, the circular movement of the pendulum is called a Coriolis effect, not a Coriolis force, since the different positions between the pendulum and the Earth are not caused by a force but only the opposite directions of the Earth against the pendulum. Of course, one might ask how, in the heliocentric system, the pendulum stays aligned with the stars. Newton's reason for this would be that the pendulum possesses inertia, and inertia is the quality of mass such that the mass resists being moved unless a force greater than the mass is strong enough to move it. Be that as it may, the important point is that in the Newtonian or heliocentric system, the bulge of the Earth, the circular movement of hurricanes, the circular movement of the Foucault pendulum, and the circular movement of the ping-pong ball, are all effects of one object moving against another, not forces. In the geocentric system, all the circular and bulging movements are caused by actual inertial forces created by the rotating universe that connect with the Earth or the skater and cause objects on them to move or expand. There is another very important dimension of the three inertial forces that will explain how the geocentric system operates. As noted earlier, the standard equation of the three inertial forces takes the form 2 omega cross v, which is the Coriolis force. plus omega cross r, which is the centrifugal centripetal force, plus d omega over dt cross r, which is the Euler force. Notice that the Coriolis force has twice the magnitude of the centrifugal centripetal force. For our investigative purposes, what does this mean and how should it be applied? Before we answer that question, let's verify this fact from Wikipedia. All physics authorities say the same, but we will use Wikipedia for convenience. The Wikipedia article on Coriolis force says the following. Quote, "In this case the Coriolis force is twice the magnitude of the centrifugal force, and it points in the centripetal direction. The vector sum of the centrifugal force and the Coriolis force is the total fictitious force, which in this case points in centripetal direction." Unquote. Notice that the total force is centripetal, that is, towards the center of the rotation, where the center of mass is located. Also notice that Wikipedia calls this, quote, "the total fictitious force," unquote. But, as we noted earlier, this is what the Newtonian system must call the total force, since it believes this force is not real but is caused only by different directions of movement of adjacent objects. In the geocentric system, the phrase would be the total inertial force or the total real force. Let's look at another explanation from Wikipedia's article of the same force equation. Quote, "It is seen that the Coriolis acceleration not only cancels the centrifugal acceleration, but together they provide a net centripetal, radially inward component of acceleration, that is directed toward the center of rotation." Unquote. As we can see, Wikipedia has replaced the phrase, total fictitious force, with, quote, "radially inward component of acceleration," unquote. This language is tailor-made for the geocentric system. In other words, as the universe rotates, it produces a Coriolis acceleration and a centrifugal acceleration. We will leave out the Euler acceleration for now since it is of little consequence. Since the Coriolis acceleration is twice the magnitude of the centrifugal acceleration, this will result in a radially inward acceleration that is directed toward the center of rotation, that is, toward the center of mass, the Earth. In geocentric terms, this means that all the celestial bodies in the universe will experience a net centripetal force on them toward the universe's center of mass. As noted earlier, this center of mass is shared by the universe and the Earth. In turn, this means that all the celestial bodies of the universe will revolve around the Earth and will be held in place by the net centripetal force generated by the Coriolis and centrifugal forces. This is why, in the geocentric system, the Sun does not fall toward the Earth in the center, or why the stars do not do so as well. The inertial forces from the rotating universe keep them all in their present positions. Meanwhile, because the Earth is the center of mass for the rotating universe and thus shares a center of mass with the universe, by definition, the Earth will not move unless the universe moves laterally, but in the geocentric system the universe's only movement is circular or angular since it has no other place to move. But because the surface of the Earth is 4,000 miles from the center of mass that the Earth and the universe share, the surface of the Earth will experience a small amount of the inertial forces generated by the rotating universe, both centrifugal and Coriolis. But since the Coriolis force is split and balanced at the Earth's equator, which is verified by the fact that the northern Coriolis force causes hurricanes in the northern hemisphere to turn counterclockwise, while the southern Coriolis force causes hurricanes in the southern hemisphere to turn clockwise, and no hurricanes occurring at the equator, this means there is no torque on the Earth and thus it will not rotate. Another way to look at this matter is that when the gravitational and inertial forces are balanced around the center of mass, they cannot generate a torque, and thus the Earth will remain motionless. Let's look again to Wikipedia to verify this fact, this time from its article on the center of mass, download April 17, 2017. Quote, "If the reference point R is chosen so that it is the center of mass, then the resultant torque, T, is 0. Because the resultant torque is zero, the body will move as though it is a particle with its mass concentrated at the center of mass. By selecting the center of gravity as the reference point for a rigid body, the gravity forces will not cause the body to rotate, which means the weight of the body can be considered to be concentrated at the center of mass. Unquote. In other words, not only will the Earth remain at the center of mass, there will be no torque to make it rotate with the universe. In general, the closer the distance to the universe's and Earth's center of mass, the less force will be experienced from the universe's inertial forces. However, at great distances from the Earth's and universe's shared center of mass, the inertial forces will be very great, especially at the rim of the universe. Since the surface of the Earth, then, experiences a small amount of these inertial forces, there will be a slight bulge at the Earth's equatorial plane. Hurricanes will rotate counterclockwise in the northern hemisphere and clockwise in the southern hemisphere, and the Foucault pendulum will turn against the fixed Earth at the same rate as the universe rotates daily around the fixed Earth.
Before we leave this section, a word of caution for researchers. Many of the quotes taken from Wikipedia are no longer on the Wikipedia sites. We have learned over the years that once anti-geocentric contributors of Wikipedia discover that material from their articles is being used to support a geocentric universe, those particular sentences will be removed from the article, but they can often be found in the talk sections of the article. This is why we note the date we downloaded the article from Wikipedia and often have a picture of the downloaded material. The speed of light. Here is another little secret about the dynamics of the geocentric side of the general principle of relativity that will show us how well it works and why the geocentric should be the preferred system. Most people are not aware that in Einstein's general relativity the speed of light and material objects is not limited to c, which is 186,000 miles per second or 300,000 kilometers per second. Let's hear this from Einstein himself. Quote, "In the second place, our result shows that, according to the general theory of relativity, the law of the constancy of the velocity of light in vacuo, which constitutes one of the two fundamental assumptions in the special theory of relativity and to which we have already frequently referred, cannot claim any unlimited validity." Unquote. Taken from Albert Einstein's book, Relativity, The Special and General Theory, 1920, page 76. You see, in Einstein's relativity, the speed of light is limited to c only in inertial frames of reference, that is, reference frames that experience no external forces, such as gravity or the three inertial forces we mentioned earlier, the centrifugal, the Coriolis and the Euler. There are very interesting ramifications to this fact concerning the speed of light. Let's allow one of Einstein's colleagues to explain. Quote, "If gravitational fields are present, the velocities of either material bodies or of light can assume any numerical value depending on the strength of the gravitational field." Unquote. Taken from William Ross's An Introduction to the Theory of Relativity, 1964, page 460. Notice that in general relativity, because gravity depends on mass for its strength, this means that the more mass in a specified location, then the more gravity, and the more gravity, the more the speed of both objects and light will be affected. This fact leads to another facet of general relativity that will also be useful in building a geocentric universe. It is the dynamic equivalence between gravity and inertial forces. In many cases, inertial forces act just like gravity. We have all experienced this equivalence, at least to some degree, when going up and down in an elevator or being stuck to the inside wall of a fast-turning amusement ride. But this just begs the question: how does this principle of equivalence affect the geocentric universe in which the universe itself is the turning amusement ride? Let's hear again from Dr. Rosser on this point. He says, quote, "If one considers the rotating Earth as being at rest, the centrifugal gravitational field assumes enormous values at large distances, and it is consistent with the theory of general relativity for the velocities of distant bodies to exceed 300,000 meters per second under these conditions." Unquote. In other words, according to general relativity, If instead of an Earth rotating in a fixed and unmoving universe we were to reverse roles, as relativity allows us to do both geometrically and dynamically, and thus we make the Earth to be at rest, that is, not rotating or revolving around the Sun, and we allow the universe to rotate daily around the Earth, what would this produce? It would produce increasing inertial forces the farther one is away from the Earth, that is, the centrifugal, Coriolis and Euler forces. In those conditions, Dr. Rosser says, general relativity allows celestial bodies to exceed the conventional speed of light by many magnitudes. In fact, the farther the celestial object is away from the resting Earth, the more it must exceed the conventional speed of light. Unbeknownst to many, this is what Einstein's geocentric version of relativity teaches. If you think about it, this kind of superluminal universe would necessarily be true, since if the universe is rotating daily around the Earth, as allowed to do in Einstein's geocentric relativistic alternative, then any object, or light beam, that is beyond our solar system, and is rotating daily with the universe, must be going faster than light with respect to Earth, and everything at the rim of the universe is traveling multi-billions times faster than c with respect to Earth. Let us recall that when Einstein limited the speed of light, he said that the limit only applied to inertial frames, that is, frames that experienced no external forces. Interestingly enough, a rotating universe is not an inertial frame. It is a non-inertial frame, that is, a frame that is continually experiencing an acceleration or experiencing a force. So that no one is confused, it is Einstein's general relativity that dealt with non-inertial frames. His earlier theory, special relativity, dealt only with inertial frames in which the speed of light was always c. But since a rotating universe is not an inertial frame, the tenets of special relativity don't apply, and thus the speed of light and material objects can be any value, depending on the strength of the inertial forces or the gravito-inertial forces. In practical terms, what does this mean? Well, if the speed of light is faster the farther away the beam of light is from a central and fixed Earth, this means that all the light of the universe, no matter how far or close to the Earth, is going to get to Earth at the same time, and thus there is no time delay. For those interested in the creation narrative in the book of Genesis, this means that when God created all the stars on the fourth day and spread them out over the vast universe, some close to Earth and some far, their light would reach Earth at the same time, since their light beams were traveling at different rates due to the varying strengths of the gravito-inertial fields along the way. This can only be true in a geocentric universe and shows again why it is the preferred system. Ether, existent or non-existent? Another thing for which we can thank Einstein in his general relativity is that he took back the ether that he had abandoned in his special relativity theory. Let's first find this out from the master himself. Einstein writes, quote, "We may say that according to the general theory of relativity, space is endowed with physical qualities. In this sense, therefore, there exists an ether. According to the general theory of relativity, space without ether is unthinkable, for in such space there not only would be no propagation of light, but also no possibility of existence for standards of space and time, measuring rods and clocks, nor therefore any spacetime intervals in the physical sense." Unquote. Taken from Einstein's speech, Ether and the Theory of Relativity, an address he delivered on May 5, 1920, at the University of Leiden. Although Einstein's recapture of ether basically contradicts his special theory of relativity that eliminated the ether, in any case, the return of the ether was a great blessing to modern science, especially as it has been developed by quantum mechanics. The basic point is that although space may be a vacuum to our senses, it is not a vacuum in reality. Space is the most concentrated yet discrete entity known to man. As noted by Nobel laureate Robert Laughlin, quote, "It is ironic that Einstein's most creative work, the general theory of relativity, should boil down to conceptualizing space as a medium when his original premise was that no such medium existed." Einstein utterly rejected the idea of ether and inferred from its non-existence that the equations of electromagnetism had to be relative. But this same thought process led in the end to the very ether he had first rejected, albeit one with some special properties that ordinary elastic matter does not have. The word ether has extremely negative connotations in theoretical physics because of its past association with opposition to relativity. This is unfortunate because, stripped of these connotations, it rather nicely captures the way most physicists actually think about the vacuum. In the early days of relativity, the conviction that light must be waves of something ran so strong that Einstein was widely dismissed. Even when Michelson and Morley demonstrated that the Earth's orbital motion through the ether could not be detected, opponents argued that the Earth must be dragging an envelope of ether along with it because relativity was lunacy and could not possibly be right. It turns out that such matter exists. About the time relativity was becoming accepted, studies of radioactivity began showing that the empty vacuum of space had spectroscopic structure similar to that of ordinary quantum solids and fluids. Subsequent studies with large particle accelerators have now led us to understand that space is more like a piece of window glass than ideal Newtonian emptiness. It is filled with stuff that is normally transparent but can be made visible by hitting it sufficiently hard to knock out a part. The modern concept of the vacuum of space, confirmed every day by experiment, is a relativistic ether. But we do not call it this because it is taboo. Unquote. Taken from Robert B. Laughlin's A Different Universe, Reinventing Physics from the Bottom Down, 2005, pages 120 to 121. Why is the ether so important, and why is it integral to a geocentric universe? Because it serves as a medium for the exchanges of heat, light, magnetism, gravity, and inertial forces across the vast universe, which exchange of forces, we should emphasize, presently has no mechanism in Copernican, Galilean, Keplerian, or Newtonian dynamics, and has always been known as the, quote, action at a distance problem, unquote. Depending on the density, permeability, structure, and particulate size of the ether, it can transport these forces of nature over vast distances in a fraction of a second. We already saw, in the non-inertial frame of a rotating universe, light and material objects can travel way beyond cn depending on the particular gravitational and inertial forces contained in the medium of space. By the same mathematics, it can be shown that gravity itself is not confined, as Einstein once claimed in special relativity, to the speed of c, but can actually travel from one end of the universe to the other in 10 to the minus 44 seconds, which is virtually instantaneously. As a result, there is no more action at a distance problem for physics, at least for geocentric physics. For more on this, see the book by Robert Sungenis, A Googleplex of Tiny Black Holes.
Well, let's summarize this. That the issue of geocentrism versus heliocentrism is not a science versus religion issue. It's always a science versus science issue. And the Bible actually is equivocal. It doesn't tell you one way or the other. So let's go to the real history and real biblical interpretation and not be swayed by this pseudo-scientific mythology that's around the topic.
And unfortunately, creation advocates have decided they are going to promote the heliocentric science and ignore or denigrate the geocentric science, just as they do in the religion side of the debate when they interpret Genesis 1 and 2 completely literally concerning creation, but then decide that all the geocentric passages in Scripture must be interpreted other than literally. It's hard to imagine a more contradictory position for those who insist that Scripture teaches scientific truths.
Lastly, we will give a response to Carter's and Sarfati's main objection to geocentrism from their online paper titled, Refutation of Absolute Geocentrism. Carter and Sarfati state, quote, "Here's the main logical problem with absolute geocentrism. It's not that we could not construct a geocentric cosmology, as one of many allowable reference frames. It's that there is no scientific or biblical reason why we would, there is no dynamic model to explain it, i.e. in terms of forces as efficient causes of motions." Unquote.
Carter and Sarfati realize that they must incorporate reference frames into their answer because modern physics, as opposed to classical physics, deals almost entirely with reference frames. But notice either their ignorance or sleight of hand. They claim that if one chooses a geocentric reference frame, quote, there is no dynamic model to explain it in terms of forces as efficient causes of motions, unquote. But is this really the case? No, not by a long shot. Let's ask the fair question. When Einstein's general relativity realized that it had to include both a heliocentric reference frame in which the Earth rotated on an axis and revolved around the Sun, and a geocentric reference frame in which the universe rotated around a fixed Earth, do you think Einstein's geocentric frame was devoid of dynamics and had no forces as efficient causes of motions? Certainly not. The whole basis of general relativity is that dynamic forces in inverted systems are reciprocal. We saw earlier, for example, that in Einstein's geocentric version, the angular momentum of the rotating universe created real centrifugal, Coriolis and Euler forces that served to control all the celestial bodies so that they remained in their respective positions as the universe's rotation carried them around the Earth. This is precisely why the Sun can revolve around the Earth at the very center without falling into it or moving away from it. As we saw in the quotes from Newton, even he admitted to this fact. What kept him from promoting geocentrism was that he did not have enough knowledge of the universe and of its dynamics to figure out that the forces needed for an Earth-centered system would present themselves if he had allowed the universe to rotate. What Carter's and Sarfati's statement also tells us is that they are ignorant of the dynamic forces in a geocentric universe, or they are deliberately hiding them from the public. As such is the case, they don't seem to be the qualified critics we once thought them to be.
Carter and Sarfati state, quote, "Therefore it has essentially no predictive value," unquote.
Carter's and Sarfati's statement is false. Geocentrism has the same predictive value that Einstein's general relativity or Newton's mechanics has for the heliocentric system, since the geocentric version will predict the same movements based on its reciprocal dynamic forces. That is, for every force that heliocentrism claims for itself, geocentrism has an equivalent force. In fact, geocentrism is the more scientific, mechanically solid, and mentally understandable model, since it doesn't hold to the somewhat magical idea of fictitious forces, nor does it hold that gravity is limited to light speed, since gravity, being a radial force, is not inertial, nor could such a slow speed for gravity ever be able to hold the universe together or have reasonable reaction times. Geocentrism is not like modern science, who, on the one hand says there is no ether, and on the other hand says there is. Geocentrism is devoid of such arbitrary and equivocal foundations. And not only does geocentrism believe and interpret the scientific propositions of Scripture at face value, but also has a viable answer to why all the starlight of Genesis 1 can reach the Earth in the same 24-hour period of day 4, the same 24-hour period that Carter and Sarfati claim to believe about the days of Genesis 1 but have no worthy explanation for immediacy of starlight. Geocentrism also explains why the sidereal day never changes. It is always 23 hours, 56 minutes, and 4.09 seconds. This is very unlikely to happen with a small rotating Earth, that has continuous and tumultuous internal movements and exists in a gigantic and formidable universe that surrounds it with numerous external forces. The more stable system is one in which the enormous angular momentum of the universe will allow the sidereal day to remain unchanged, as it has for thousands of years and counting.
Carter and Sarfati state, quote, "Geocentrism is useful in some respects, however, for launching things into orbit, for pointing Earth-based antennae at geostationary satellites, for plotting the position of stars, etc. Yet, because it lacks predictive power, a fully comprehensive geocentric model would be very, very complicated. They would need to add terms almost at random to account for the thousands of variations easily explained by geokineticism."
In reality, as we noted earlier, it is geokineticism or heliocentrism that has the problem. That is because F equals ma won't work to get a space probe to its desired destination without adding in the very forces that the Newtonian heliocentric system says are only fictitious. Geocentrism has an easy time of plotting the paths of space probes because the inertial forces, the centrifugal, Coriolis and Euler, are already operating as real forces in outer space. In fact, when NASA or the Jet Propulsion Laboratory send satellites and probes to various places in space, they use the ECEF model, that is, the Earth-centered Earth-fixed frame, or they use the ECEI model, that is, the Earth-centered Earth-inertial frame. In other words, NASA and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory assume that the universe is geocentric. That is because the geocentric frame is easy to operate, and is more accurate than the solar barycentric frame. In fact, the ECEF models are used to correct the solar barycentric model. Additionally, the omnipresence of inertial forces in a rotating universe is the reason that spiral galaxies spin much faster than what Newton's equation, F equals ma, allows. Instead of inventing dark matter to solve the problem as the Copernicans do, geocentrists merely rely on their system's inherent mechanics to provide the answer, which is that the universe's inertial forces are the strongest in deep space where the galaxies exist, far away from Earth. The real reason why Carter and Sarfati say, quote, a fully comprehensive geocentric model would be very, very complicated. They would need to add terms almost at random to account for the thousands of variations, unquote, is that they don't understand the physics of geocentrism, which is easily noticed by the antiquated arguments they use. They continually talk from the perspective of the Ptolemaic or Tychonic mode, which were purely geometric models absent any force dynamics, as if that is what modern geocentrists are teaching. Quite the contrary. Let's look, for example, at how the geocentric and heliocentric systems calculate the placement of geostationary satellites, otherwise known as weather satellites. As we know, the geostationary satellites are those that stay at one position over the Earth's equatorial plane. As for how this occurs for the heliocentric system, they first must incorporate the rotation speed of the Earth, which is 1040 miles per hour at the Earth's surface. They next need to calculate how fast the satellite must travel, west to east, to keep up with the Earth's rotation, west to east, considering the satellite is about 22,000 miles above the Earth. The geometry says the satellite must travel about 7,000 miles per hour. In other words, they must bring the satellite up to an altitude of 22,000 miles and then launch the satellite toward the east at 7,000 miles per hour. After that, they rely on the inertia or momentum of the satellite to maintain the 7,000 miles per hour speed. But since a moving object in the Newtonian system seeks to travel in a straight line, they must calculate the amount of centripetal force needed from the Earth's gravity at 22,000 miles high so that the satellite does not fly off into space but will follow a curved path with the rotating Earth. In order for the math to balance out, the centripetal force from the Earth's gravity must be counteracted by an equal but opposite centrifugal force that pulls away from the Earth. But this is only true on paper, since there is no real centrifugal force in Newtonian mechanics. As for the Coriolis, since geostationary satellites remain directly above the Earth's equator, there will be no Coriolis with which the satellite has to contend, for there is no Coriolis on the equatorial plane. As for the Euler force, they will only need to add it at the beginning of the launch, but not afterwards. For any geosynchronous satellite that will weave above and below the equatorial plane by the fact that it was launched at a different inclination or speed than the geostationary satellite, the Coriolis will come into play such that the engineers will explain the amount of weave by appealing to a fictitious Coriolis component that is the result of the satellite moving faster or slower than the Earth is rotating. The geocentric model is similar, except that the inertial forces are real. Hence, although the speed of the Earth's rotation will not be needed, the speed of the universe at 22,000 miles above the Earth is needed. The geometry tells us that speed of the rotating universe at 22,000 miles above the surface of the Earth is 7,000 miles per hour, east to west. Hence the satellite will be brought to an altitude of 22,000 miles and will be launched toward the east, just as the heliocentric model launches toward the east. In other words, the satellite will thrust west to east while the universe is moving east to west. In order for the satellite to stay exactly one position above a fixed Earth and not be carried around by the turning of the universe east to west, the satellite must be given a thrust of 7,000 miles per hour in the opposite direction, that is, west to east. Since in the geocentric system there will be a real and precise centrifugal force generated by the rotating universe at 22,000 miles above the Earth, the gravity of the Earth must have an equal and opposite force to pull on the satellite so that it doesn't fly off into space. As for the Coriolis force, a geostationary satellite will not contend with it since the Coriolis force is zero at the equatorial plane. As for the Euler force, it will only be felt at the actual launch of the satellite, but not afterward, and it will be the same value as the fictitious Euler force in the heliocentric model. For any geosynchronous satellite that weaves above and below the equatorial plane due to the fact that it was launched with a different speed and inclination, it is the Coriolis force of the rotating universe that will cause the oscillation. If any other satellite is launched with a different inclination, speed, or altitude, the universe's Coriolis force will have a direct effect on the path the satellite takes. As we can see, there is nothing complicated about the geocentric explanation.
Carter and Sarfati state, quote, "There is another, perhaps stronger, point to make. Geokinetics is the best way to understand the physics. The equations of motion are the simplest for the particles that orbit in a center of mass system and when the center is used as the origin in the coordinate frame."
Perhaps without knowing it, Carter and Sarfati have just validated the geocentric system, since from its basic structure, geocentrism is a system whose equations are based on the center of mass of the system as being the origin of the coordinate frame. And the coordinate frame just happens to be the rest of the universe. As Genesis 1 says, the earth was built first and then everything else was built around it, namely, the firmament, and the celestial bodies, on day 2 and day 4, respectively. As such, the Earth is the center of mass for the rotating firmament and celestial bodies. A simpler system could not have been devised. But the center of mass that Carter and Sarfati are referring to is not the center of mass of Genesis chapter 1, but the center of mass of Copernicus and Newton who rejected the biblical account. The only center of mass of which they were interested is near the Sun, so that the Earth and planets must revolve around the Sun. Of course, the only way Carter's and Sarfati's single center of mass can be manifested is to make the same mistake that Newton made, which is to exclude the rest of the universe. In their entire video, not once do they consider what forces could come from the universe and thus have separated themselves from post-Newtonian physics. Of course, Carter and Sarfati may retort that the Newtonian system works, and we can predict movements of planets, comets, asteroids, and even predict the existence of Neptune. This is only partly true. As we stated, they can only do so if they add fictitious inertial forces to Newton's equations and assume the universe is fixed, otherwise the planet Neptune might have remained undiscovered. Moreover, as we noted earlier, modern science has found that Newtonian mechanics does not work for major portions of the universe, that is, those that contain spiral or other galaxies that rotate. F equals ma only produces 1/10 of the actual acceleration. Lastly, and most important, we should also say that just because a particular system can predict movement does not mean the system is the actual system that is physically operating or the only one that is possible to physically operate. For example, 2 plus 2 equals 4. But so does 3 plus 1 and the square root of 16. Which of these sets of addends is the correct combination is dependent on how the particular system is constructed, not on whether we can reach the number 4.
Carter and Sarfati state, quote, "Science thrives on making predictions, and Newton's 3 laws of motion and theory of gravity, with Einstein's further refinements, are one of the most amazing predictive engines in history," unquote.
Carter's and Sarfati's reference to, quote, Einstein's further refinements, unquote, is quite an understatement. As we noted earlier, it was Einstein who found the defect in Newtonian mechanics. Relativity only went one way for Newton, the heliocentric way, at least until we discovered the last page of Newton's Principia that never made it to his publisher. But Einstein's relativity allowed both heliocentric and geocentric options, and the geocentric option was not merely a kinetic model, but a dynamic one as well. It is this dual aspect of Einstein's relativity to which neither Carter nor Sarfati have yet graduated, or about which they are being deliberately obtuse.
Carter and Sarfati state, quote, "Since Scripture doesn't demand that a stationary Earth is the only valid reference frame, that is, absolute geocentrism, why would we hold to an Earth-centered, Earth-fixed reference frame?" Unquote.
The scientific reason is that it is so much simpler and satisfying to have an Earth-centered reference frame. With a fixed and absolute point as the base and standard, everything else in the universe can be measured accurately, and even things far away can be triangulated with the Earth to know exactly where they are in the universe. We wouldn't need to depend on the complicated world of special or general relativity, since nothing would be relative. God gave us this standard of measurement by giving us a fixed Earth. Why would we not want it, is the better question. As for Scripture, it makes no demands on historical facts. It merely states them. Whether one believes them as they are literally stated in the narrative is another matter altogether, and it is a rather sad one, since many will insist on a figurative sense if they choose not to believe the literal is possible, as Carter and Sarfati do with all the geocentric passages. As for Sarfati, that he would base his whole understanding of the universe on one verse of Scripture, Acts 27:27, that he believes provides us with different reference frames from which to choose, shows the lengths some will go to avoid the geocentric system, and remain with the popular, and job-saving system, the heliocentric. Be that as it may, Sarfati missed the fact that Acts 27:27 was showing how the Greeks presented an illusion to the text, not how the Greeks introduce us to the complicated world of reference frames so that we can then conveniently create our own cosmology. Illusions never have the prerogative of presenting themselves as reality, just as we know land does not move toward a boat. But when one insists Acts 27 is teaching the nature of reference frames so that he can give himself the opportunity to conclude that Scripture allows him to choose the reference frame he prefers, is certainly not something we should be pinning on the Greek language, much less the inspired St. Luke who didn't believe in heliocentrism. As for Dr. Carter, he showed us the inadequacy of his biblical hermeneutics when, after he insisted that, to come to a correct interpretation of a passage, one must investigate the context, grammar, phraseology, and etymology of the Hebrew or Greek. He then concluded that neither Psalm 93 nor 1 Chronicles 16:31 could be interpreted literally, but he did so without ever examining the context, grammar, phraseology, or etymology, of either passage. Rather, he deliberately superimposed his figurative interpretation of Psalm 121 onto Psalm 93 and 1 Chronicles 16:31. Apparently, his rule of interpretation is, if a word is interpreted figuratively in one place it must be figurative in all places. But any first-year student of biblical hermeneutics knows this is false. Second, we must point out again that Dr. Carter and Dr. Sarfati are well known for their rather literal interpretation of passages, such as Genesis 1 and 2, and many other passages that speak about creation. They protest when an opponent takes the word day from another biblical passage that uses the word day figuratively, and concludes that he can then hold that the word day in Genesis 1 should also be interpreted figuratively. Carter and Sarfati will provide all kinds of reasons why day should not be interpreted figuratively in Genesis 1. To no surprise, we will agree with them, since we also support biblical creationism. By the same token, there are all kinds of reasons why all biblical passages speak of the earth as motionless and always speak of the sun as moving, should be taken literally, but Carter and Sarfati are not as fair with these passages as they are with those that support creationism.
Carter and Sarfati state, quote, "If you can't use gravity to explain the motion of objects in the solar system, you can't use gravity to explain the motion of space probes flying among those objects. It is that simple." Unquote.
Gravity in the geocentric system will always work in local frames, that is, large masses that exhibit gravity, as we demonstrated, for example, of the pull from the Earth on a geosynchronous or geostationary satellite. The difference between a heliocentric and geocentric system is that in the geocentric the local systems are not operating in a fixed universe but are in a rotating universe. As such, inertial forces permeate the universe. We experience them on Earth whenever we move from an inertial path. In short, gravity and inertial forces work together in the geocentric system. The fact that Carter and Sarfati don't know this fact means they don't know how the geocentric system works and thus have been making their statements and critiques from ignorance and misrepresentation.
Carter and Sarfati state, quote, "Here's the main scientific problem with geocentrism. If absolute geocentrism is true, then the laws of physics are not universal. That is, experiments we do on Earth cannot apply to things outside the atmosphere because Newton's laws of motion and gravity cannot explain what we are seeing. This is a big problem, for every time we do something in outer space everything behaves as if it would here on Earth." Unquote.
Dr. Carter should know better, since he must be aware that spiral galaxies spin 10 times too fast for Newton's laws of motion. As for the laws of physics, they are indeed universal, but one must begin with the proper universal law before he starts applying it to the universe. Since Newton's laws only work in an inertial frame, that leaves 99% of the universe unaccounted for, since most of it is operating on a non-inertial basis. There are other flaws in Newton's mechanics. Newton had no physical mechanism to act as a medium for his gravity, and thus he was always hampered by the action at a distance problem. But for his gravity-based system to work as designed, he desperately needed an instantaneous gravity. Since he didn't provide one, then his gravitational equation, F equals gmm over r squared, which doesn't contain a factor for time, is merely a driver without a vehicle. Also, Newton didn't know the cause of gravity. He could only tell us how fast gravity would make an object move in a radial direction. Additionally, Newton depended on what he called inertia, that is, an aspect of matter in which it resists acceleration. But Newton never explained what caused inertia. In the end, Newton's theory of motion is filled with effects without causes. That handicap is due partly to the fact that his absolute and inert universe offered him no such causes. Once Newton separated the solar system from the universe, he was on his own to explain how it would work, and he came up short on many fronts. In the geocentric system, we understand how the universe functions much better than Carter and Sarfati. In the geocentric universe, inertia is caused by the inertial forces from a rotating universe. Gravity is caused by the difference in pressure between the ether of space and the ether inside baryonic matter. Gravity moves faster than c because of the discrete makeup of the ether in which it travels as a compression wave, and thus there is no action at a distance problem, and this is supported by Einstein's general relativity. Light is faster than c outside our local environs due to the increase in gravito-inertial forces the farther the radius from the Earth, as is also supported by Einstein's general relativity. In short, once we understand the ubiquity of the rotating universe's inertial forces, we can then calculate how each celestial body is going to be affected by those forces. Not only that, we need not limit the speed of light to c, since a rotating universe is not an inertial frame. Likewise, we also don't have to limit gravity's speed to c. As such, the universe can hold itself together very well and won't suffer from an action at a distance problem. For further information on these issues, see A Googleplex of Tiny Black Holes, by Robert Sungenis.
Carter and Sarfati state, quote, "Absolute geocentrism requires a universe that does not work according to Newton's laws. Yes, you can attempt to describe the way things revolve around the Earth in an absolute geocentric system, but gravity cannot be used to explain the motion of those objects. Another force is required to glue the universe together."
As we have seen, Carter and Sarfati are ignorant of and have misrepresented, the geocentric system of dynamics. Gravity is certainly a vital part of the geocentric system, but unlike the fictitious world of Newton's dynamics, geocentrism incorporates real inertial forces that work in tandem with gravity and as such give us a universe that is glued together quite well. But as we indicated earlier from the last page of Newton's Principia, even Newton came to the realization that, quote, another force, unquote, originating from the universe itself would be required to put the Earth in the center and have the Sun and planets revolve around it as in the Tychonian system. So the geocentric system took Newton at his word and demonstrated that the, quote, another force, unquote, comes from a universe that rotates, since that rotation creates the precise inertial forces needed to put the Earth in the center. Unfortunately for mankind, the understanding that the universe can cause such forces to exist would not be discovered until 200 years after Newton, namely, by Ernst Mach and Albert Einstein. Apparently, Carter and Sarfati have no notion of this kind of system and thus misrepresent geocentrism as a system based purely on geometrical kinematics and not also force dynamics.
Carter and Sarfati state, quote, where does the change occur? Certainly before we get to the moon, for that must orbit the Earth once a day. But we cannot detect any such transition. We can fly a plane, launch a satellite, send things to the outer solar system, and there is no place where Newtonian mechanics does not apply. Unquote.
Let us repeat again that the laws of physics apply universally, from the center of mass that the Earth and the universe share, to the rim of the universe itself. There is no change that occurs before we get to the moon. For the record, let us also state that the moon goes around the Earth once per day because it is carried along with the universe that daily rotates around the Earth, although the moon also has an independent movement around the Earth which occurs every 28 days or so. Let us also state again that Carter's and Sarfati's statement, quote, we can fly a plane, launch a satellite, send things to the outer solar system and there is no place where Newtonian mechanics does not apply, unquote, is simply not correct. Without the addition of the three inertial forces, Newton's mechanics of F equals ma will never get that probe to its desired destination. Let's verify this admission by quoting from Wikipedia. Notice this stark admission regarding getting space probes to their designated destination. Quote, as a result of this analysis, an important point appears: all the fictitious accelerations must be included to obtain the correct trajectory. Unquote. Wikipedia's reference to, quote, correct trajectory, unquote, refers to the path that the space probe must take to get to its designated destination. Also, Wikipedia's reference to, quote, fictitious accelerations, unquote, are the three inertial forces, the centrifugal, the Coriolis, and the Euler. In other words, Newtonian mechanics does not work in doing what Carter and Sarfati claim unless the three inertial forces, which are not part of Newton's system, are added to Newton's system. Interestingly enough, this quote was removed from Wikipedia in the past year and replaced by wording that was a little less stinging, which often happens when geocentrists quote from Wikipedia to support geocentrism. The remaining quote at Wikipedia says the following. Quote, these additional forces are termed inertial forces, fictitious forces or pseudo-forces. By accounting for the rotation by addition of these fictitious forces, Newton's laws of motion can be applied to a rotating system as though it was an inertial system. They are correction factors which are not required in a non-rotating system. Unquote. Although this quote says essentially the same thing as the previous, one will not know this fact unless he knows the physics. Without stating that the space probe will not have the proper trajectory, this quote still admits that Newton's laws don't work for most of the universe unless, quote, correction factors, unquote, are added to his force equations. In colloquial terms, this means that Newtonian mechanics must add fudge factors to make it appear as if it can calculate how to send a space probe to Mars. This sleight of hand has been used in Newtonian physics for over 300 years.
Carter and Sarfati, state, quote, for example, late in 2014, the Rosetta spacecraft from the European Space Agency successfully arrived at and orbited Comet 67P/Churyumov-Gerasimenko. In a delicate and complex series of maneuvers, the craft deposited the Philae lander on the surface of the comet. Everything about that rendezvous is explained by Newtonian physics, and it is the same physics that works here on Earth.
Yes, one can convince himself that it is explained by Newtonian physics as long as the non-Newtonian inertial forces are added to the Newtonian physics. But Newtonian physics, without fudge factors, could never get the Rosetta spacecraft to orbit the comet 67P. But don't depend on Carter or Sarfati to tell you that painful fact.
Carter and Sarfati state, quote, if everything out there behaves as expected based on experiments here on Earth, does this not mean that geokineticism is true and absolute geocentrism is not?
Again, not all things out there behave as we expect them to in Newtonian mechanics, such as spiral galaxies spinning 10 times too fast for Newton's F equals ma. Those who believe Newtonian mechanics will still work in outer space have been forced to invent a rather ridiculous amount of extra matter to make the m of F equals ma account for the rotation curve of spiral galaxies. It is appropriately called dark matter, not because it is really dark, but because they have never found it with any known instrument. But they need to make people believe it exists, otherwise Newton will finally be falsified after 300 years of his physics ruling the world.
Carter and Sarfati state, quote, if you can't use gravity to explain the motion of objects in the solar system, you can't use gravity to explain the motion of space probes flying among those objects. It is that simple.
Yes, it is that simple. That's why geocentrism does not exclude gravity in calculating the motion of objects. But unlike the Newtonian system that only has gravity, the geocentric system has additional forces, and they are called inertial forces, and in the geocentric system those inertial forces are as real as gravity, and act very similar to gravity. The Newtonian system does not have these inertial forces and thus they must add them to F equals ma as if they were real. But the Newtonians don't believe they are real, but are fictitious. It's really that simple.
Carter and Sarfati state, quote, absolute geocentrism is then nothing more than stamp collecting. One cannot make many predictions. One can only describe what is seen. Essentially, they can describe observations without being able to explain those observations. Unquote.
Again, this statement by Carter and Sarfati only reveals that they have not done their homework and have not the slightest idea how geocentrism works before they came to this debate.
Carter and Sarfati state, quote, the power of the geokinetic model lies in the fact that it is based on a simple observation that can then be used to explain multiple phenomena. Unquote.
In reality, the only reason Carter's and Sarfati's geokinetic model can appeal to explain any motion in the universe is that they steal the inertial forces from the unikinetic model, that is, the rotating universe model which produces real inertial forces. They then add them to their geokinetic model like a magician pulls a rabbit out of a hat.
Carter and Sarfati state, quote, the Achilles heel for those few who still believe the Earth does not move is that their model is nothing more than a list of unrelated phenomena.
In reality, the Achilles heel of the geokinetic or heliocentric model is that it reveals the utter duplicity of those who, on the one hand, would die a martyr's death to defend reading Genesis 1 literally in order to save the doctrine of creation, but, on the other hand, arbitrarily decide never to read a single geocentric verse in Scripture literally, and instead, consistently appeal to quote, the Bible's phenomenological language, unquote, of words like sunrise and sunset, words that everyone, on both sides of the matter, already recognize as phenomenological. It also reveals either the sheer ignorance or the sleight of hand from scientists who worship at the feet of Newton without telling the audience that his theories don't work unless the geocentric inertial forces are added to his equations. It reveals why the same scientists do their best to avoid the geocentric side of Einstein's general relativity and instead make glib remarks to, quote, reference frames, unquote, or, quote, Einstein's added refinements, unquote, as if they have thoroughly dealt with that side of the matter, and at the same time they proudly tell us that they can pick the reference frame that suits their cause and avoid the other that doesn't fit with their ideological or theological agenda. This means we might have to wait for the next generation of biblical exegetes who are not afraid to take all of Scripture at face value, not just the portions they prefer, so that we can thoroughly challenge the spiritual and scientific zeitgeist of the Copernican world and not merely the Darwinian.
When you're from my block, they say you ain't special. Very few will be king. You're just a speck in the whole universe. Luck and chance is the thing. But I found out what they have kept secret. Healed my pride and the hurt. Brilliant mind said God is more than watching. Woke up and realized I'm the center of the universe. I am, I know it. And you are, you know it. Oh, we going. Hey, to the center of the
small town boy with a big town dream. Small town, sorry, I gotta leave. Now I'm in that big town scene. Did the big town spit out the week? And I've been here 5 years strong, but my spaceship losing throttle. Once felt like the center of the stars, like ancient Greeks, Aristotle. Now that Copernican model, my frame of mind, I'm insignificant. Somewhere off in the distant reaches of space and time. No creator, just randomized, no longer destined for me to shine. Get a call, granny dying, home was calling, perfect timing.
From my block, they say you ain't special. Very few will be king. You're just a speck in the whole universe. Luck and chance is the theme. But I found out what they have kept secret. Heal my pride and the hurt. Brilliant mind said God is more than watching. I woke up and realized I'm the center of the universe. I am, I know it. And you are, you know it. Oh, we going. Hey, to the center.
And I see you in grandma's bed. She said you're home, but your dream ain't dead. Nah, check the principle, learn from this. Galileo changed views of Copernicus. I'm confused, is this just some kind of deathbed gibberish? I asked her to explain the significance. Some kind of sixth sense, somehow she know I'm playing on quick. She hit me with, it don't matter what your last name is. Yo, you neatly cracked it. Booker T was a slave before a black activist. And Eminem was trailer park bound before master riches. I told her that way back when I first started spitting. Never question your significance, baby. You've been so significant since you've been a baby. See, it ain't earned, it may be learned. I get your point, so I'ma turn it up.
I am, I know it. And you are, you know it. Oh, we going. Hey, to the center of the universe. I am, I know it. And you are, you know it. Oh, we going. Hey, to the center of the universe. From me to the heavens, to the air that I'm breathing. I'm here by design, time to shine on the earth. So ring the alarm for those who are sleeping. Wake up, I'm the center of the universe.
We're talking school, the stars in the sky signify we're not the bullseye. Evidence weak is hypothesized. The rules been pulled all over our eyes. And I don't believe just cause the Ivy Leaguers with pond scum don't be algae eaters. Grandma told me don't be deceived. Can y'all feel my dark energy? Can y'all feel my dark energy?
I am, I know it. And you are.